Hey everybody, well, who wants to do some fiberglass? Well, I suppose maybe the better question should be, who needs to do some fiberglass? Let's get started. So in the last episode, I had mentioned that there were going to be a few different types of repairs that we need to do on here. And I've gone through and kind of broken those down into essentially 5 different categories, I guess. We've got some small holes to deal with, and some larger holes to deal with, some stress cracks or spider webbing in the gel coat, and some, just some general voids, defects from when they laid up the glass originally, and also just some general fairing. So let's take a look at each of those different types of repairs and talk about them in a little bit more detail. Now you're going to be hearing me talk about what's called a cord deck. And I guess looking at my really fancy graphics here, what that is if you were to take this panel and cut it in half, and you're essentially looking at it as a cross section, the way that these layers stack up is on the top, which is what we sanded off. You're going to have your gel coat non-skid. That's the surface that you walk on. That's the surface that you see. Then below that, you're going to have a layer of glass, typically around an 1/8 inch thick, give or take. And then you're going to have what's called a core. Now, this coring material can be a number of things. It can be, well, what was traditionally used and what's still used today is balsa coring, which is just end grain balsa wood, kind of laminated onto a fiberglass backing. But you can have balsa coring. You can also have plywood coring. And something that's a little bit newer in boat construction, by newer I'm meaning within the last 10, 15 years, is a foam core. Now, there's advantages, disadvantages for each of these, and I'm not going to get into that today, maybe at a later point with a different episode, but sticking with the task here. And then below that, below your coring, you're going to have another layer of fiberglass mat or fiberglass, so that this coring material is essentially sandwiched in between 2 layers of glass. We're going to start off by looking at the what I consider small holes, and by that I mean they're essentially old screw holes. And size-wise, I consider anything 1/4 inch or less to be a small hole. And these are probably the most common and actually the easiest to deal with. And the way that we're going to deal with these is we're going to first come in and drill out the hole. By drilling this out, we're going to allow the epoxy to bite onto fresh fiberglass up on the surface, as well as some fresh balsa inside the coring. And then we're going to come in with a little Dremel tool, and we're just going to dish out or taper the sides around here so that when the epoxy is laid in, it has a little bit of a lip on the top here to kind of bite onto and have a better hold. Now for these small holes, I'm going to be using West System epoxy, and I'm going to be thickening the resin with one of their additives. Now the additive that I'm going to be using here is their 403, and really for something like this, you could use almost any of their additives. I mean, a hole this size is really, I don't want to say it's incidental, but there's no structural issues related to it. It doesn't go all the way through. There's really, it's more cosmetic in nature, at least in my mind. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to wipe this down with some acetone to clean the surface, and we're going to mix up our epoxy. And after the resin and the hardener have been well mixed, then we're going to add in our additive, and then we're just going to just slowly pour it in until it's filled. Now it probably will, over the next few minutes, it will probably seep in a little bit, and we'll need to come back and touch up, adding a little bit more resin just to make sure that it stays filled. But beyond that, we're just going to let this cure, and after it's cured, we're going to come back, sand it flush, and this one is ready for priming and painting. Now this next area is what I consider the larger hole, and this is probably, if you can see I guess the circle on the top here, this is probably about 3/4 inches wide. And the reason we need to look at this a little bit differently is, well, because of this. This hole was filled exactly the same way as the smaller hole, but this originally. However, because of the size, this kind of popped loose, and what we've got on a number of different areas here is you're able to see kind of this round little halo, and that's just an area that popped loose. And if this actually happened on a finished surface, I would be just a little upset. So we're going to deal with this a little bit differently. We're going to add a little bit reinforcement here, but the general process is relatively the same. Essentially, what we're going to be doing is, again, looking at this as this is the top surface that you would walk on. This would be the bottom. In the middle here would be your coring material. Now, let's just say that this little cutout here is this hole. What we're going to do is we're going to come in and we're going to sand a taper on this top surface, kind of extending all the way around here, say about 2 inches around the perimeter of this hole. But we're going to be tapering this edge in, filling the hole with epoxy, letting that cure, and then coming in and layering in 2 layers of CSM. And what that's going to do is that's going to build this surface back up, and then we'll be able to sand this nice and flat and have a nice smooth surface for laying our primer on. Now, just as a little side note here, I will say that when you're working with CSM, epoxy typically isn't the resin of choice for laminating this, just because the different fibers in here in the strand matting, they're held together with a polyester-based binder. When you're wetting this out with, say, like a polyester or vinyl ester resin, those binders in the glass, they more or less just kind of melt, and the glass becomes much more pliable. When you're wetting this out with epoxy, that doesn't happen. Those binders kind of become suspended in the epoxy, and it doesn't conform to the curves and radiuses quite as easily. However, because we're working with a flat surface here, that's really kind of a non-issue. It's reinforcement. It will still cure within the epoxy, and it's going to add the strength that we're looking for to prevent that hole plug from being able to pop out. And for tapering the surfaces around these larger holes, you can use a grinder. I'm going to try and keep the dust down as much as I can in the building here. So I'm going to be using a sander with some 80 grit paper that's hooked up to a vacuum. So I know it's not going to catch it all, but it should catch most of it. And because I'm going to actually be getting down into the glass layers, I'm going to be wearing my respirator. One concern that I want to bring up is that whenever you're dealing with resins, whether it's epoxy, polyester-based, or vinyl ester, it really doesn't matter. You need to keep in mind how much resin you're going to be working with and how you're going to be storing it, and how thick your material is actually going to be. All of these resins, they cure exothermically, meaning that they give off heat. And if the layer that you're working with is thick enough, they can actually ignite. So something to keep in mind. Now, the reason I bring that up is it wasn't a concern at all for these smaller holes, but for these larger ones, the gap that we're going to be looking to fill in there is about 3/4 of an inch thick, and I'm not sure how much of that's actually going to seep sideways inside the laminates. So I'm going to do this in probably 2, maybe even 3 pours, just to keep that heat build up to a minimum. So I'll come in, I'll do my first initial pour, and I'll let that, I'm not going to let it fully cure, but I'll let it start to, I guess what I kick or set up. It'll be tacky. I mean, it'll be hard, but still tacky. Once you get to that point, then the peak of the heat that it's giving off has already come and gone. So once it gets to that tacky stage, then I'll come in and I'll do another pour. And if I'm up to the surface, great. If I need to do a little bit more, again, I'm going to let that tack up, and then I'll come in and pour my third final one, and that should fill everything. So I just want to bring that up, and the process is still going to be the same as what we did for the small ones. We're going to wipe the surface down with some acetone, and we're going to mix up our epoxy with some of their filler. Again, I'm using 403 filler. Honestly, it's just because of what I've got, but it'll work just fine. And then after that has cured, completely cured, then tomorrow or even later today, depending on how late I'm here till tonight, I'll come in and I'll sand that epoxy, and then I'll start laying in my fiberglass. Now, just to give you a little bit of, I guess, perspective here, the hole that we actually filled is right here. But yet, we sanded all the way out to this perimeter here because we want to have some overlap or some meat for this fiberglass we're going to be laying up to actually tab onto some outside solid material so that this hole does not pop back through. So the next step, we're going to come back in, give this a wipe down with some acetone to clean it off, and then we're going to tear off 2 pieces of chopped strand matting, and then we're going to use epoxy to put that in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tear off 2 chunks. I'm not going to cut this because then it's going to give me a hard edge. By tearing it, it leaves me these nice little wisps on here, and that helps the edges just to kind of naturally taper off and just gives you, I guess, a smoother finish from step 1. You don't have to do any additional fairing afterwards. So this is another little time saver. Tear your CSM, don't cut it unless you really have to. So now I'm going to be tearing these pieces in 2 different sizes because I'm going to plan on doing two layups, 2 layers of glass for each patch. And the first layer that I'm going to tear out is going to be about this big. Give a little reference. This is the size of the original hole. So it extends about 3/4 inch around the outside of the hole. And then the second and last layer is actually going to come almost all the way out to the perimeter. So it kind of looks like a little bullseye, but that way we're getting overlap, and as the feathered edges here are getting, I guess, closer to the finished surface on these outside edges, then that's where those having the wisps from tearing this is going to come into play. And you're going to see here in a minute when it's all sanded down, it just tapers right off. It just works really nice. So for our first piece, let's see, since we're going to be looking at something about 2 inches in diameter. And you just eyeball this. So there's our first piece, which may be a little bigger than what I was originally talking about, but that's all right. And then the second piece is going to be larger than that. And one thing when you're tearing this chopped strand matting, if you're tearing in one direction, all of a sudden you get to kind of it doesn't want to tear anymore, come at it from the other side, and it'll peel. The rest of it'll peel right off. So there's 1, and there's 2. First step before you always do anything, I guess, kind of as a general rule when working with composites, is you always clean. Clean, clean, clean. You want to make sure that you get a good bond. So I'm giving this a wipe down with some acetone, and then we'll start laying up our epoxy. Now for laying this up, I'm just going to be using just a disposable chip brush. Just why use up a nice brush for epoxy? Because after you use it, it's pretty much shot. And just a small mixing cup, and I'm going to be using, again, like I mentioned before, West System, their 105 and the 205 resin. So I'm going to start off just to see what kind of distance I get. I'm going to do 1 pump of each, one of resin, 1 of hardener. I'm going to mix these up really well. I'm going to keep this resin straight. I'm not going to add any kind of filler or thickener to it. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to wet the surface out first thing. And just add a nice little, for lack of better words, a blotch of epoxy on there. And then I'm going to take the smaller piece, lay that right over top. And I'm going to tap this down. I'm not going to brush it because that's just going to pull the strands of this glass kind of everywhere. So you want to kind of tap the resin into the glass. And after you get it all wetted out here, you'll be able to see if there's any little air, voids, air pockets in that, and you'll just kind of tap the brush and move just kind of walk the little air bubbles out of the glass. So I walked all the bubbles out of that first layer, and I need more resin. And because I'm using epoxy, I am not concerned at all about having, I guess, a resin-rich layup. You know, typically when you're working with polyester resins, the strength from your laminates comes from the combination of resin and the glass. But polyester resin doesn't really have any strength to it. So if you have a resin-rich layup using polyester, the laminate is actually brittle, whereas epoxy has structural strength to it by itself. So if it's a little resin-rich, no harm, no foul. All right, that looks pretty good. Take a close look here. I don't see any bubbles. I'm pretty much for walking, if there were any, and there were, but I've already walked them out. But all I'm doing is I'm just kind of lightly tapping, and I would move the bubbles out to the edge, and then they just push out of the edge of the laminates and they disappear. So that looks good. We're gonna let that cure, and then we'll come back and sand this down, leaving the sander flat, and then we are going to be ready for priming. Now I've sanded all these areas down using 80 grit paper, and for the most part everything came out perfect. It's, you know, nice and flat. You know, I don't have any humps or bumps or, you know, high spots, but I do have a couple little low spots or, you know, pits. And when you're looking at these here, you know, they're deep enough where they're gonna create a problem, you know, when I'm working with paint. Since we did our layup on here using epoxy, my general rule of thumb is to always try and keep like with like. For example, you can put epoxy over top of a polyester or vinyl ester resin. However, the other way around doesn't really work too well. And just out of curiosity, I'm going to be doing some tests with that, and I'm going to video the experiment and see how it turns out. But generally, it's an accepted rule that you really don't want to put polyester-based material over top of epoxy. Other way around is fine, but poly over epoxy, it's not something that's practiced all that often. So, so because this was laid up with epoxy, I'm going to come in with some thickened wet system. I'm going to be using their 410 filler, and then I'm just going to lightly trowel this over the top, let it sit up. Tomorrow morning it'll be a nice quick sanding, and then these are ready for priming. And we'll just give this a quick wipe down with some acetone. Now I'm not going to need very much here, but the smallest amount that I can dispense out of here and know that I get my measurements correct are, you know, basically one pump of each. So a pump of resin, pump of hardener, and then I'm going to mix those up really well. And then I'm going to add my 410 filler. Now the consistency that I'm going to be looking for here is, well, probably like ketchup. I don't want to have it so thick that the filler itself creates, you know, little air or little pinheads in here, or air pockets. So I'm going to keep the mixture a little loose. And the reason I'm using this is the 410 filler is actually what's called their fairing filler. It's easy to work with, it sands easy, and it works really well. Same deal, a little blop. And you see, when I'm making these passes, come at it from a few different directions. If you're always making the swipe in the same direction, there's a good chance you're gonna, I guess, just fill one side of a hole or of a pinhole and not necessarily fill the entire hole. Okay, now the next two things on the list are going to be chips and voids, and really you deal with those generally the same way. The name of the game, I guess, you know, in a nutshell, is to basically remove any loose material, scuff it up, and go back over top of it with, well, what I consider more of a fairing compound. Now, what I like to use, it's a product that's made by AdTech. I'll put the thing in the video here. But it's AdTech, it's their P14 Ultra White Filler. And what this is basically it's a gel coat paste, but it's a fast cure product. So when you mix this up with a paste hardener, it's ready to sand in probably 10 minutes. So when you're trying to get something turned around quickly, or at least get some surface defects taken care of, so that you can go ahead and lay your gel coat up, it's really, really nice because you can lay it up, And by the time you start getting your gel coat mixed up, this stuff is ready to sand, and you can just keep right on rolling. So I really like this stuff. So let's take a closer look at how we're going to, I guess, address each of these little things, and we'll get her filled in. So the first of these two that I'm going to look at a little closer is going to be the voids. And if you look here, it just looks like it's, well, voids, you know. They're just like little pieces of the surface are just missing. So what I'm going to do is just come in with a point and just kind of chip off any of the loose material until I get back to, I guess, what looks like solid glass. And then I'll go ahead and give it a quick sanding with some 80 grit, wipe it down with some acetone, and then I'll lay in my filler. Now typically with voids, and when I'm talking about chips, I'm talking about damages or, you know, chunks of gel coat that are missing where there hasn't been any damage to the actual fiberglass beneath it. It's just more or less like the gel coat or the surface just let go of the fiberglass underneath it. I will say that when you're looking at voids like this, when these can be something that can look really small at first, and then as you start picking away at it, they can just grow. I've had some voids that, you know, started out as a bit of a pinhole up on the top, and I started chipping away at it, and there would be that void may have extended to about the size of a baseball. You really just don't know how big it's going to be until you actually start picking it away. But regardless of the size of the void, generally it's the same process. You're going to chip away the loose material, give it a sanding, clean it up, and then you're going to go over top with some fairing compound. I will say I do not recommend Bondo. You know, you want to use a marine grade product, otherwise it's going to allow moisture to wick through that surface and get underneath it, and it more than likely down the road it's just going to pop back off again. So use a good quality material, and this AdTac stuff is pretty cheap. I want to say it's maybe, I don't know, 20 bucks a quart, and a quart will go a long ways. Yeah, all the loose material's been picked away, and I'm getting pretty solid material here now. So as long as that looks good. I was going to go over with some sandpaper, but given how small these are, I think it's just going to be easier to come back in with a Dremel tool. Nice and simple. Give it a wipe down with some acetone, and let's fill it in. So I've already pulled out 2 little piles of this AdTac filler here onto I put on a plastic spatula. And then now I'm just going to use some white cream hardener and smooth it in. And you don't need much. And just mix it up real good. I like to come in, kind of scrape it up and work it in. Now you do have to work kind of quick because you only have about well, depending on the temperature, you only have about a minute until it starts to kind of stiffen up on you. So peel a little bit off, and I'm just using a plastic knife here, and I'm just gonna spread it in. And I'm squeezing it in. I want to make sure that I don't have any voids underneath here. And it's better to overfill than to underfill. I mean, you can always come back and lay in more, but get it all done in one shot, and you don't have to come back and look at it at all. All right. Well, I'm just going to let that set up for 5-10 minutes, and in the meantime, I'm going to come over to the chip, and we're going to take care of that. And here here's our little chip. You can follow the arrow. But all I'm gonna do is, again, I'm taking some 80 grit paper, and I'm just more or less roughing it up, tapering the edges. Nice little bead. And we'll just work it in. Here's a little technique that I like to use. Sometimes you can just get this all filled in one shot. Sometimes it's best to try and do it in 2 different layups. And here's what I mean, because I'm looking at this here, and the void, it's not entirely on single flat surface. It's on this flat surface here, as well as extending over to the lip here, or the edge. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in on this ledge first and fill it in this way so that it's creating a bit of a crown right there. And then I'm going to take a little bit more and very carefully pull this lip over. I'm just grabbing the tip of it and pulling it over. And then I'll smooth out the edges. And I usually like to start in the middle and work my way out so I don't end up with a thin spot on the edge, or a thin spot on one edge and a fat hump on the other end. If that makes any sense. If after I sand this it's still a little low in a spot, no big deal. Give it another wipe down with some acetone and do a final layup to get the right shape. So we're going to let this cook for 5-10 minutes, and we'll come back and sand it down. Perfect. At least that one turned out perfect. Yeah, same thing here. A couple little swipes to kind of round over the edge. Beautiful. Beautiful. Okay, so here's the chip, or what used to be a chip. Didn't have to come back at all and touch it up. And here's what's left of our old voids. Perfect. That's ready for priming right now.